Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma daf Samachay. Today's daf is sponsored by the Wilczek family in memory of their son Ozi on his 5th yurtzeit, and by Gita Neufeld in memory of her father on his yurtzeit, Yosef Benachem Mendel Vepesha, Philip Jaroslawish, and by Harriet Hartman in memory of her husband Moshe ben Yehuda Aryeh Zichrono Livracha. I wish we had been able to learn daf Yomi together, and I hope my learning is helpful to his neshama. And by Rabbi Michael and Alexis Singer, Mazel Tov to our daughter Miriam on her graduation from Jacob and Barak Hebrew Academy. We wish her continued success at Lisk College and Columbia University. We're so proud of you as you keep up your study of Talmud. And by Sharon Russ for the Frosh Lema of Ruchama Adina Bat Mazel Shifra Chaya Tova. Ruchama is, God willing, having surgery this morning. May we hear good news and may she have a speedy and complete recovery. Okay. Before we start, I just want to talk about also the siyums. So we're going to have a bunch of different siyums for Masechet Yoma. One will be in English on Zoom as usual. That will happen on July 11th. And we're also going to have siyums in Hebrew around the country, in Israel, in all different locations. So keep posted on details. They'll either be Thursday night or Friday on July 8th or 9th. So we're heading toward the end of the Masechet. We have less than a month to go. And the exciting news is that I know, besides the fact that we've been dealing with sacrifices for a very long time, and the interesting service of the Kohen Gadol, which has been enlightening in so many different ways, even though it seems tedious and detail oriented about we've brought meaning to it from all different ways, but we are getting to the part about Yom Kippur that might interest you possibly more or just in a different way, which is the fasting and the tshuva and the things that we generally, before we started learning Masechet Yoma, really thought about mainly when we thought about Yom Kippur. So we're going to be getting to that already next Wednesday. So we're nearing the end, and that's the last chapter, which is all about that. Okay, so with that, we're going to get started with our daf. We saw yesterday a machloket between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, if you remember, about the issue which. Okay, again, let's go back, and we have the diagrams from yesterday. I'm not going to pull them up again, but if you want, you can look at them, which is we have two Seirim, Seir Lashem, Seir Lazazel, and the Seir Lazazel dies, and then we have to do a new lottery. And then the question is, which goat LaHashem is used? We have two goats left that are LaHashem. One obviously goes Lazazel, the replacement one, but now we have two that we did a lottery for that came out LaHashem. So which one gets sacrificed and what happens to the other? So it was clear in the Mishnah that whichever one the other is, wasn't clear which one, but whichever one the other is left to graze, because it said in the Mishnah that ein chatat tzibor meta. That's what we're going to focus on today a lot, which is if it was a communal offering, it's not left to die. Normally, if you have a korban chatat that was designated and then rejected or can't be used for whatever reason, so normally the chatat, there's 5 cases where a chatat is left to die. But this is not a chatat of an individual, it's an offering of an individual, it's just an offering of a community. So comes Tanakam and says a community offering isn't left to die if it gets kind of left aside. To which Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says, no, I think it is left to die. He says tamut. That's first of all that you have to remember. The second thing you have to remember before we get started is this big machloket Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Which animal is left to graze and not to die? And Rabbi Yehuda thinks it's left to die, and which animal is not. So Rav had said, it's the first animal is the one that we use, the one that was originally chosen, remember, because he says mitzvah b'rishon. And when we talk about the one that's left to graze, we're talking about the second one. Rabbi Yochanan says the exact opposite. The first one was rejected. Remember, he holds ba'alei chayim nidchim. The first one got rejected because he lost it to his pair. It's the second one that gets sacrificed. Okay, so there's this debate. So let's go. Now we're going to have some questions against Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. 2 questions against Rav, 1 against Rabbi Yochanan. That's going to be the structure of the first half of today's shiur. So we're starting from the bottom, 3 lines from the bottom of Samach Daled Amud Bet. Tnan. It says in the Mishnah, She'en chatat tzibor meta. That's what I just said. It's left to graze because it's not an individual offering. Now, what does this imply? That if we had the exact same case, but instead of it being a communal offering like the Shiur, which is for a sin offering for everybody, it was an individual offering and the same kind of thing happened. You wouldn't have the exact same thing because we did a lottery here and we don't do a lottery on a regular one, but the same idea basically that you had one came to replace it, and then we used one or the other, depending on Rabbi Yochanan or Rav. So if you had that exact same scenario and it was an individual offering, it would have died, would have been left to die. So Bishlam Rabbi Yochanan kid Rabbi Abba Amarav. Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is going to work very well, as Rabbi Abba said in the name of Rav, about a Mishnah in Tmura. Before we continue, let's read the Mishnah in Tmura. Okay, and this you can find on the sheet. I brought it on the study guide. The Mishnah Masechet Tmura reads the following. It's chapter 4, Mishnah Gimel, third Mishnah. Hamafrish chatat ve'avda. There is no exact parallel case here, so we're going to take something similar. You designate a sin offering, and it gets lost. This is an individual sin offering. Right? This is like we talked about the Pesach the other day. You now take another one in its place. Lo ispik lahakrivan. Now you didn't get sacrificed, and what happened? You already find the lost one. So now when it comes time for sacrificing, you have two in front of you. It's very similar to our case, where we have two in front of us. Meaning if none of them was blemished, obviously if one is blemished, we're going to pick the one that's not. But if neither of them is blemished, Rebbe thinks that we pick anyone we want, one of them gets sacrificed to chatat, and the other one is left to die. The chachamim omrim, en chatat meta, you don't leave it to die. It's only if they already got atonement for one, then the other one's left to die. But if you didn't do atonement yet, and they're both in front of you, then they don't die. Okay, it's not left to die. That's the machloka between them. Now, we don't yet know how this relates. Let's keep reading. So Rabbi Yochanan, now let's just remember, Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says that Baalei Chayim nidchin. You always have to just remember that. They're rejected, which means the first one gets rejected. We're going to use the second one. And the first one that was rejected is left to graze. And if it were in a yachid case, and that's the important part that we're dealing with now, it would have been left to die. So now, the reason it's to graze here is because it's a communal offering and not an individual offering. Only individual offerings are left to die. So Amar Rabbi Abba Amarav, Hakol Modim, even though this is machloket Rebbe and the rabbis about whether in that case where one was lost and you found the other one and it was sacrificed, they were both in front of you when it came time to sacrificing, is it left to die or is it left to graze? They both agree though. She'im nitkaper b'she'ena avuda, avuda meta. They both agree, though. This seemed to indicate it's always left to graze, right? If you choose one over the other, then the other one is left to graze if they're both in front of you. But now they're going to say it's not true. It depends which one was chosen. If you chose the first one, which was the one that was lost, then the second one would be, wait, 1 second, let's just read it. They both agree that im nitkaper b'she'ena avuda. If they chose the second one, the one that wasn't lost, and they didn't use the first one, avuda meta. They both agree in that case that the first one, since it was the original one and you didn't use it, it has to be left to die. So when the rabbis said, we think ro'eh in this case, they only meant ro'eh in the case where you chose the first one, the one that was lost and then found. If you chose that one, the second one, why? The second one wasn't really, it was only brought as a replacement. So if you didn't use it, you didn't use it, you can't, it's sanctified and there's nothing else you could do with it, but you leave it to graze, right? Leaving it to die is much more severe than leaving it to graze. Leaving it to die means, and I'll repeat this even though we talked about it a number of times, leaving it to die means this is sanctified and there's nothing you can do with it. You can't take off the sanctity in any way. If it's left to graze, it means it's sanctified. We wait till it gets a blemish. Once it's blemished, we can redeem it for money and use that money to buy a korban. That's a less severe of a problem because there's a way to redeem it. Meta means all you can do is leave this animal to die. There's nothing else that can be done with it. There's no solution. We can't get rid of the kedusha in any way, shape, or form. So why is that? Because it's totally rejected. You rejected this one, right? So if you use the one that wasn't lost, then the one that was originally lost and found is going to be left to die. So now that makes sense according to Rabbi Yochanan, because again, what did Rabbi Yochanan say? It's the first one that is left to graze, meaning if it were a communal offering, then it would be left to die. And that's exactly what everybody agrees with. Okay, so that's the situation. The details, I see you're asking, what are the details of leaving it to die? So I don't remember if we leave it without food and drink, like we basically leave it in this closed area and there's nothing we could do with it till it actually dies. I think it's possible that we don't give it food and drink. I don't remember all the details, but it's kind of, left on its own and we don't really deal with it and we leave it till it dies. It's a bit of a harsh, it's not exactly punishment for the animal, but it ends up being kind of a punishment for the animal, right? I'm leaving aside the issues of how do we deal with this, right? It's a difficult issue. It seems a little bit inhumane. Then again, the whole world of sacrifices is from a different world and a different understanding of animals, et cetera, and their place in the world. That's for a whole different shiur. Ela l'Rav, but according to Rav, now Rav says we use the first one and the second one is left to graze. Now, the second one was brought really as a replacement for the first and shouldn't necessarily have to die if it were a communal offering. Remember, this is all based on an inference that it says in the Mishnah, this is left to graze because ein chatat tzibor meta, because it's a communal offering. But if it were individual, it would be left to die. So now the question becomes, this doesn't sound like a situation, according to Rav, if we use the first one and what we're talking about, the second one is left to graze, it wouldn't need to die if this were an individual case. Why not? It's more similar to the following case. It's more similar to someone who's mafrish shechat ha'olach. What does that mean? I have to bring a sin offering. So I designate an animal for my sin offering. But what if I say, listen, I'm a little worried something might happen. I want to make sure that I'm set. So I designate two animals. The second one being there for in the event that something happens to the first, I leave it. So first of all, I'm just going back because Becky wrote that you do close it up in a room and you starve it. So it is that you don't let it have food and drink. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, so now it's like mafrish shechatot lachrayut. And now what's the halacha about this? You can see already why this would be less severe. Because when I designate the second one, I already know that I'm not necessarily going to need it. Likewise, in our case, when I do the second lottery, according to Rav, I know that I'm not going to use the Shiur LaHashem. I just have to put it through the lottery because that's how I get my Shiur LaZazel. I can't do it without a lottery. But I know from the beginning that I'm not planning to really use it, which is kind of like the second one, la'achrayut. Now, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, so what do? Mitkaper be'achat mehem. You choose whichever one you want because you just took two and you said, I'm taking two just in case something happens. Vashniya tir'eh. So the second one is left to graze, which means that this isn't so, it's not so harsh in an individual case. You wouldn't say meta. So the Mishnah says in the parallel case, it would be meta. That doesn't make sense according to Rav. So how could that be? So we're going to now have an answer. Kevanda amar Rava, Rav savarla ki Rabbi Yossi, damar mitzvah berishon. So wait a minute. We're going to say this case is really not like mafrish sheni la'achrayut. Mafrish two la'achrayut means I'm taking two that could potentially be used for sacrifice, and one gets chosen, the other one we leave because we don't really need it. That's not, it wasn't, what's the idea of meta? It means this was sanctified and rejected. But that one was never rejected, really. It's just that we didn't use it, and that's why it's left to graze. But this one, Rav holds, like it's the way Rav explained Rav, is that he holds like Rabbi Yossi, who said mitzvah b'lishon, meaning we know from the beginning that the mitzvah is going to be done with the first one, the one that was part of the first lottery. So when we do that second lottery, it's not like I'm being mafrish la'achrayut in case I need another one. Why am I doing the lottery? I'm doing the lottery because I need a Shiur LaZazel that underwent a lottery. Therefore, they're going to say like this, me'ikara ki mafrish le'ibud dami. It's like I designated that one to be destroyed. In other words, I knew when I did that second lottery that I will never use this second one LaHashem. Therefore, if that were similar case and it was a korban individual offering, that would be like I designated something to go to be destroyed. In other words, it would have to be left to die because that was it was like I designated something for something that was never meant to be anything. That's worse because I'm designating in a way that it can never, ever be used. So therefore, it would have to die. So therefore, we can explain, Rav, that you wouldn't compare it to shtei chata'ot l'achrayut. It's not really similar to that case. It's more similar to someone who's mafrish, knowing that he's not going to use it. That's different. And that's why it would have a more severe punishment, or not punishment, have a more severe end to it, to it. Bishlama Rabbi Yochanan. Now we're going to again have a second question on Rav. Rabbi Yochanan makes a lot of sense. Okay, we'll see why in a minute. Da'amar sheni shebezug sheni yireh. They're just quoting what his opinion is. That which one is left to graze? It's the second one from the. It's the right sheni shebezug. Sorry, it's the second one from the first. Really means it's from the first set. That one is the one that's left to graze. Why? Because look at the continuation of the Mishnah. Now we're going to deal for the next two sections with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda said two things in the Mishnah. First, he said, I disagree with Tanakama, and I think that Yamut, the Rabbi Yehuda Yamut, right? Now, Rabbi Yehuda said, I disagree with you. You think it grazes. I think it's left to die. Now, you remember we saw yesterday that Rabbi Yehuda, why does he say Yamut? Because he thinks that Baalei Chayim are nidchim, they're rejected. And the first one was rejected because its right counterpart was dead. So it's rejected, and therefore it's left to die. To which Rabbi Yochanan said, no, the first one is left to graze. It's not left to die. Yes, it's rejected. They agree that Baalei Chayim nidchim, but it's left to graze. So now, and it's not Rabbi Yochanan, it's Rabbi Yochanan's reading of Tanakama. So the machloket is very clear now between Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda on this point, which is mitkaper. So the Rabbi Yehuda Yamut and mitkaper b'sheni shebezug sheni, meaning we're assuming that Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda only agree on one point at this point, which is, does it graze or does it die? Now, which one is Rabbi Yehuda referring to? It's clear he's referring to the one from the first set, because he holds, we already discussed, and that's going to be from the next line in the Mishnah about Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbi Yehuda holds Baalei Chayim are rejected, which means the first one was rejected, so the first one's left to die. In which case, Rabbi Yochanan says, which one is left to graze? The first one. So they're both arguing. When Rabbi Yehuda says Yamut, it sounds like he's saying, the one you think is supposed to graze, I think is supposed to die. That only works with Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yehuda thinks for sure it's the first one that's left to die. And Rabbi Yochanan says that Tanakama thinks the first one is left to graze. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, you read the Mishnah like this. Rabbi Tanakama says the first one, the original one, because it lost its pair, it's left to graze, to which Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's left to die. But if you want to read the Mishnah according to Rav, L'Rav Da'amar, again, it's Rav's reading of Tanakama. He says Tanakama said, Sheni shebezug sheni yireh. L'Rabbi Yehuda Yamut, L'Rabbi Yehuda b'may mechaper. If we're going to say that Rabbi Yehuda comes to disagree with Tanakama just about does it die or not, so we're going to say, does it die or does it graze? Is it left to graze? So Rav is talking about the second one. Rav thinks we sacrifice the first, and the second one is left to graze, to which Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the second one is left to die. Now what's the problem? Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, according to this reading, the second one from the second lottery is left to die. But Rabbi Yehuda also says that the first one is left to die because it was rejected. And Baalei Chayim nidchim, that's what he holds. That's the next line in the Mishnah. In which case, we're going to have a problem because he's left with nothing. The first one's left to die because it was rejected. And the second one is left to die because he says, Tanakama, you hold graze, I think die. Now, it's a bit of a strange way of reading the Mishnah, and the Gemara is going to reject this immediately and say, this is really not a problem because Misavart, why did you assume that Rabbi Yehuda Sheni Shebezug Sheni Kai? Why did you assume that when Rabbi Yehuda said Yamut, he was disagreeing with Tanakama about that? He agreed we're talking about the same animal, but disagreed about what's supposed to happen to that animal, which is what got us into this problem in the first place. So why do you think he's talking about the same animal? Rabbi Yehuda Sheni Shebezug Rishon Kai. We were just saying, no. When Rabbi Yehuda said Yamut, what he said is, I disagree with you about which goat we're talking about, and I think that one is left to die. So again, what happens, according to the Mishnah, according to Rav? Tanakama says it's the second set that's supposed to be left to die, supposed to be left to graze. It's, right, we use the first one because mitzvah berishon. The second one is left to graze. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's the first one, and it's left to die, not to graze. So he disagrees on 2 points in that one line, and That's what we say, and that makes sense according to Rav. Now we're going to say, but wait a minute. There are some who actually ask the question in a different way from Rabbi Yehuda. Instead of asking from that line on Rav, they ask from the next line of Rabbi Yehuda, and according to Rabbi Yochanan was the question. And this is a question we actually kind of addressed yesterday also. V'od amar Rabbi Yehuda, nishpach adam yamut ha'mishtalech, met ha'mishtalech yishafech adam. We didn't exactly word the question this way, but you'll see in the end that it matches a question that we had yesterday on Rabbi Yochanan. If the blood spills, okay, now we're not talking about dying, but it's a similar situation. The blood of the Seir LaHashem spilled. So we have no blood now to sprinkle on the altars and in the Kodesh Kodeshim and all that. What do? You have to bring a new set of animals to put under the lottery. And Yamut HaMishtalech, the first one is left to die. That's Rabbi Yehuda, because he holds, this is where you see it, that it's clear, Ba'alei Chayim Nidchim. Animals get rejected. And once it lost its pair, gone, you can't use it. Well, and in the opposite case, Meta Mishtalech, if the Seir Mishtalech were to die, Yishafech Hadam. You have to start the blood from the beginning. In other words, no, not start from the beginning, but you have to spill the blood, take 2 new animals, the Seir, you'll replace the Seir Mishtalech, and you'll replace the one that you're supposed to use the blood for, meaning you can't use the blood of the first animal. It's the same idea. Rejection, right? This animal got rejected because he lost his pair. You have to start, and you have to pick a whole new animal. So how does this work? Well, Bishlam al Rav. Now, there's 2 parts of Rabbi Yehuda. First, he disagreed about the issue of tamut or yireh, right? Is it left to graze or does it die? Then he disagreed on the issue of are ba'alei chayim nidchim or not. So now we're going to say like this. Bishlam al Rav, according to Rav, remember, Rav held and this is what we saw yesterday. The Tanakama holds that ba'alei chayim are not rejected. And then comes Rabbi Yehuda and he disagrees and says, no, I think Ba'alei Chayim are rejected. So therefore, this works very well. There's 2 statements of Rabbi Yehuda. It says, Rabbi Yehuda says tamut. And additionally, Rabbi Yehuda said this issue about the blood spilling, you kill the Mishtalech. The Mishtalech dies, you have to spill the blood. So, Bishlam al Rav, Reisha Pligi b'chatat tzibur, v'sefa Pligi b'Ba'alei Chayim. The first debate between them, and I made a little chart on this on the page. The first debate is, the Tanakama holds, a chatat tzibur is not left to die, right? If you have a chatat tzibur and it's rejected for some reason, it's not needed, it's not left to die, it's just left to graze. And Rabbi Yehuda thinks no, even though it's a communal offering, it also gets left to die. The second machloket, the va'od, comes to say, and additionally, I disagree with you about which animal we're talking about because I think, comes Rabbi Yehuda to say, Ba'alei Chayim are rejected, and therefore we're talking about the second one. Right? He doesn't say in those words, but he basically says, if one thing happens to one, his pair is left to die. It has to be rejected, it has to be killed. So clearly, and Tanakama holds, no. It's the first one that we use. And the second one is the one that's left to graze. So they disagree on 2 points, and that's why it says ve'od, and additionally. But if you're Rabbi Yochanan, who thinks that Tanakama already thinks that animals get rejected and that we're talking about the second pair and not the first. The first one is the rejected one. You use the second one, if that's the case, right? And then which one is left to graze? It's the first one. So yes, they disagree. Left to graze versus sacrificed. But that's where their disagreement ends. Ve'od, my ve'od. It's not necessary to say ve'od amar Rabbi Yehuda. That's obvious because Tanakama already said we kill the first, right? We leave it to graze, the first one. They're only disagreeing on the issue of, is it left to graze or is it left to die? But they both agree it's the first animal that gets rejected. So you don't need that second line to say, Nishpach Adam Yamud HaMishtalech. We already know that. You just said Yamut. So we know you think it's left to die. We don't need to specify any more than that. To which the Gemara answers, Kasha. This is in fact difficult. And it's not so strange that we say this because it's really a repeat of yesterday. If you remember, we already brought this point up. We already said that according to Rabbi Yochanan, our Mishnah makes no sense because our Mishnah sets it up as if Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Tanakama about Ba'alei Chayim Nidchim or not. And that's why we started on the second side of yesterday's page. We said Mishnah works like Rav and Rabbi Yochanan works like some Braita. Now, he has a Braita that supports it, but our Mishnah really doesn't work out with Rabbi Yochanan. And here's the same kind of issue. Okay, it's the exact same proof. It's just they're reading it in a different way. That second Va'od of Rabbi Yehuda makes absolutely no sense because it sounds like Rabbi Yehuda disagrees on 2 points and he really only disagrees on one, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, now we're going to deal with this line. So that was 2 questions on Rav, 1 question on Rabbi Yochanan. We answered them all. Now moving on. That's just a quote from the line we just said. We're now going to talk about this line. Something doesn't make so much sense. Bishlama, okay, a bishlama structure, which we've seen a bunch of times today, which is this makes sense and this doesn't. Okay, so bishlama nishpach adam yamuna mishtalech. If the blood gets spilled, we understand why the mishtalech is left to die. Why is that? Ta'akati lo et avi mitzvateh. When does the Shiur mishtalech get sent? Once you've done all the other actions, you've done the sprinkling of all the bloods. If you don't do the sprinkling of all the bloods, you can't send the mishtalech. So if the blood spills before you finish sprinkling all the bloods, then you're going to have to do a new lottery. And again, this animal got rejected. Again, according to those who think that animals get rejected, this is Rabbi Yehuda who believes that. Then you'll say the Shiur Mashalach was rejected because if it couldn't yet, right? We didn't yet do the mitzvah of Haza'at Hadam, which is what permits us to send the Shiur Mashalach. So of course you have to finish what you started, bring a new animal for that, and only after that will the Shiur Mashalach be worthy to be sent, in which case we need to do a whole new Hagrala, and we're going to reject that first Shiur Mashalach. But Meit Mashalach, Hama Yishafech Hadam, Hayit Avle Mitzvatei. What mitzvah has to be done to the Shiur Mashalach? But let's do the reverse, right? With the Shiur Lashem, before you do the Shiur Mashalach, you have to finish all the Avodot with Shiur Lashem. That's the order. But what has to be done with the Shiur Mashalach before you can do the sprinkling of the blood? The only thing that has to happen to it is that it goes through a lottery process. We already did that. So it went through a lottery process. The Shiur Mashalach, its mitzvah was finished. Now something happens to the other Shiur. Theoretically, you might say the Shiur Mashalach wasn't rejected because it did what it had to do before the Shiur Lashem went. So why would it be left to die? So Amri Debe Rabbi Yana Ya'amod Chai Lefnei Hashem Lechaper. Ad Matay Yezakuk La'amod Chai Ad Sha'am Matan Damim Shel Chavero. It says, we saw this pasuk yesterday, that the Shiur is supposed to stand alive before God to atone. Now they learn this to atone. What's to atone? Atone is always a reference, or often a reference, to the sprinkling of the bloods, which means that it's true that it went through the lottery already, and that is what permitted us to sprinkle the blood of the Shiur Lashem. If it hadn't gone through a lottery, it wouldn't have been able to. But there's something else that has to be done with the Shiur Mashalach in order to permit the sprinkling of the blood. And what's that? It has to stand alive, meaning it has to be alive when you're sprinkling the blood. So therefore, if Meit HaMishtalech, that's why you have to sprinkle the blood, because it's no longer standing alive. Has to be standing alive when you sprinkle the blood. Therefore, there is some sort of element of the Shiur Mashalach that's needed for the sprinkling of the blood beyond the lottery. Okay, and therefore you need to bring a new animal right away before you continue, right? And that one has to be left to die because it was rejected, because that one couldn't stand chai, and therefore that one couldn't be used. Okay. Next, Tanan Hatam. Now we're going to bring a Mishnah in Shkalim. We're going to go a little bit off topic, although we're still kind of same topic, but we're going to bring a Mishnah in Shkalim, and Abai is going to bring a question against that from a Braita that talks about something similar to what we've been discussing. And then it's going to go for the rest of the daf. We're going to try to come up with several answers. We're going to reject many of them. Okay. And we're not going to even finish this sugya today. It's going to continue through till tomorrow. It's a good review because we learned this Mishnah in Shkalim already. So we'll continue. We send our shkalim, right? Our city gets together. We give all our shkalim to a messenger, and he takes them to, right? This is the mitzvah machatzit shekel. You have to bring the money to the temple. From that, all the communal offerings are bought with that money. So we send our money with a messenger. Now, what happens? This is a classic Bava Metzia case. What happens if they get stolen or lost from the messenger? Who's responsible? So it's going to depend on the following. It's going to depend on if the Nitrima hatruma. Okay, remember what Trumat Alishka is? When they took all the money, we just discussed this, and they took it out of the boxes. This was the Aleph Bet Gimel, right? And they start with Aleph, and they take all the money out that was brought to the temple, and they start buying the offerings with it. They would do it 3 times a year. They would take the money that came in, and they would buy the offerings from it. Now, the assumption is when they take that money, they have in mind, right? Imagine we just saw yesterday, Aleph Bet, or 2 days ago, Aleph Bet Gimel, right? It's Aleph Bet Gimel. It means they might not even use all the money that came in. They start with Aleph. If they don't have enough money, they go to bed. If they don't have enough money, they go to the third box. They might not necessarily use all the money that came in. And likewise, they don't necessarily use all the money that was collected. They obviously don't use the money that we collected and gave to our messenger if he hadn't yet shown up in the temple. But since I already gave my money and you gave your money and we, our whole community gave their money and it's on the way to the temple, when they do Trumat HaLishka, they have in mind that this is covering all the shekels that are even on their way to the temple, not just the ones that are in the box that we're not even using, but it's kind of, they include everybody in it if they've already given their shekalim. So therefore, if they did the Trumat HaLishka before they got stolen, but after we already gave them the money, nishbe'in legizbarim. So now there's an issue if something gets lost or stolen in general. This comes up above the mitzvah. Let's say I'm watching your phone for you, and then somebody steals it. It's in my house, and I have a robbery that night. Someone steals it. Now I go to you and I said, "Listen, someone had a robbery last night, a break-in, and they took your phone." Now, how do they know that I didn't just pocket it and keep it for myself? Because it's very easy for me to do that. It was in my house already. It was in my property. I don't have to do anything except just hide it somewhere. So because of the concern that someone's going to hide it and claim it was lost or stolen, therefore, we make the person swear that it was lost or stolen so that we make sure that people don't take advantage. We assume people don't swear unless they really mean it. It's like a deterrent. So therefore, likewise, this guy, he lost the stuff on the way or it got stolen. He has to swear, but to who does he need to swear? Who's responsible for the money? So basically he swears, and where do we consider the money? We consider as if the money was delivered already. So he swears to the Gizbarim, listen, to the temple treasurer, he says, listen, the money didn't make it. I took the money from them, but it didn't make it. And then nobody has to really put out any extra money. But im lav, if they hadn't done Trumat HaLishka then nishbe'in the b'nei ha'ir, he goes back to the people of the city, he said, listen, this terrible thing happened. I got robbed on the way. Someone mugged me and I have no money left. And b'nei ha'ir shoklim acharim tachtehem. They have to give another machatzira shekel to people because their machatzira shekel never got to the temple. Even though in the first case it never got to the temple, it ki'ilu got to the temple because of the Trumat HaLishka. Nimtzeu, here's the important part. Nimtzeu oshechziru magadavim. Let's say we gave 2 machatziyot shekel now, right? We each gave 2 half shekels because he swore that it was stolen. Then he finds the money, or the robbers return the money. We now gave double. So what happens to it? Well, you would hope that maybe it would go to next year's money, but no. They're both, so we gave extra money to the temple, basically. That's all that happens. You can't use it for next year. So next year, I'm going to have to give again. Rabbi Yehuda, he disagrees, though, and he says, Olin lahem l'shana haba. This is the important part for our purposes. He says, no, you can use it for the following year. So now, he says, wait a minute. But we have another case where you end up with 2, which is going to be very similar to the things we're discussing. And we don't say you can save it for next year. So why not? And Rabbi Yehuda specifically. So let's see. You have a part seir that got lost for Yom Kippur, and you designate a different one instead of it. Likewise, a seir that we use for avodah zarah for the community sins with avodah zarah. We've discussed that one. Kulam yamutu. Okay, all of these have to be left to die. Again, you lost one. This is what we've been discussing. You then took a different one, and then you found it. The other one is left to die. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That matches what Rabbi Yehuda said in general, right? It's left to die. So they say, right? This is again classic. Rabbi Yehuda said chatat zibor is meta, and they think chatat zibor isn't meta. So this works fine with the Rabbi Yehuda we discussed before, because he says it's left to die. But it doesn't match what he said in Shkalim. Why don't we just say, you have now 2, let's just take the Shiur Yoma Kippurim or the Par, right? You have 2 of them now. This doesn't have to do with the lottery. This is a whole different thing. You designated one, it got lost. You designated another, you found the lost one. Now you have 2. So save one for next year, just like the Shkalim. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees in the other case about the Shkalim. He says, save it for next year. So why don't we say, save it for next year? So Amarle, we're now going to have, as I said, 4 different answers to this. Korbanot Zibor Ka'amarta. You're comparing shkalim to korbanot. Those are not the same thing. Communal offerings like the Par and Seir and Yom Kippur and the Sirei Avodah Zarah have different laws. Shani korbanot tzibor k'de Rabbi Tavi amar Rabbi Yoshaya. They're different. Amar Rabbi Tavi amar Rabbi Yoshaya. In other words, there's a unique reason by sacrifices why they can't be used the next year. Why is that? And it's not true for the shkalim. It's true the shkalim go to buy the communal offerings, but it's just money until you buy the communal offerings. So Amalka zot olat chodesh b'chodsho. Amra Torah chadeh. Right. This is a pasuk when it talks about the sacrifices. This is the olah of each month in its month. Amra Torah chadesh v'haveli korban mitchuma chadasha. Each year's sacrifices have to be brought from that year's shkalim. So therefore, you can't take a par from last year's money and use it for this year. Can't be done. That's a unique law by sacrifices. But money that I gave twice this year, I can put one of them toward the following year. To which the Gemara says, wait, this doesn't really make sense. Hatinach seir. This works very well with the seir because the seir was brought. It would have to be something that was bought with communal funds. But par ma'ika lememar. Who spends the money on the par? Remember the par? It's for the Kohen Gadol. He buys it with his own money. It's not from communal funds. So therefore, it doesn't make sense at all for the par. It's not bought from communal money. So you should be able to leave it for next year. To which the Gemara answers, Gzera par atu seir. Well, we don't want to make a differentiation between the bull and the goat. People will get confused and think the goat too can be left for next year. So we say the bull also not, even though theoretically you really could. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Mishum Gzera yamutu. I understand. We have two things going on here. We found the par. Let's just take the par. Just look at the par. Because the par right now is just a gzera, right? Just in case we confuse the law. We have two parim we designated for the same sacrifice, right? One because one got lost, so we designated another one. Now, what we say is you can't use it for next year. That's number one. Number two, you have to leave it to die because since you can't use it for next year, you have to leave it to die. So they say, I understand you can't use it for next year because people might confuse it, but you're going to leave the animal to die. And this for all those people who are struggling with this, they don't want to have any extra situation where you're going to leave the animal to die. That's very harsh. If it's just a gzera that you might confuse the par and the seir, we're going to leave the animal to die because of that. That doesn't make any sense. It's just a gzera. When it's a halacha, we have this halacha l'mosh misinai about all the cases where chatat tzibor meita. We understand, but this is just maybe you'll confuse with the seir. We're going to make it die. That sounds crazy. Ve'od, and additionally, ha de Rabbi Tavi am Rabbi Yoshia gufa mitzvahi. To am Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel korbanot tzibor rabbeim b'cha b'nisan mitzvah levi min hachadash v'mevi min hayashan yatsa ela shechisir mitzvah. That whole thing about buying it from the new money, it's a good thing to do. It's a mitzvah. But if by accident you brought it from the old money, it's fine. So what do you see here? That according to Shmuel, it's just a mitzvah. You don't even have to. You can do it. So theoretically, you should be able to use it from last year for this year. So, yeah, this is a classic case of a b'diavad situation, not an ideal situation. It's true we didn't choose to do this, but we ended up with this. We should save it for next year. So that's not a good answer. So Ela Amar Rabbi Zera, answer number 2. The animal has to undergo a lottery. And since it has to undergo a lottery, the lottery that year. So you can't use it. What happened in the seir case? We brought 2 seirim, one got lost, right? We did the lottery, it got lost. We brought another 2 animals. We did another lottery. It underwent a lottery. But for this, right now we have 2 animals that underwent a lottery, but now we want to use them for next year, but it has to undergo a lottery next year. So not this year. This year won't help you for next year. So they say, okay, so for native and Negro, so fine. Take it next year. Have it undergo a lottery again next year. What's the big deal? So here's a very interesting answer. We're worried what people are going to know. Now, interesting what people know here and what people don't know. We assume that people will know that you took last year's goat, but we don't assume that people will know that it underwent a lottery again. They'll think that maybe it doesn't need to undergo a lottery since it did it last year. They won't see because they don't see what goes on in the temple, and they won't see that you put it under a lottery again. So therefore, people might confuse the halacha and think that it doesn't have to undergo a lottery from this year. Okay, it's a little weak, but okay, it could stand. But what's the problem? Obviously, this only works for animals that there's a lottery for, which is the goat, not the bull. So therefore, hatinach seir. That makes sense for the seir. Par ma'ika lamemar. What's the reason? Oh, gzera par atu seir. Oh, it's a gzera of a par that you might confuse it with the seir, right? Now, this is weird because the whole thing is Xera. It's Xera that people will think that you can do a goral from year to year. And then it's Xera of the par on this year, which you should say really it's Xera al Xera, but that's not what they say. But again, they still have the same problem which they had before. Mishum Xera Yamutu, you're going to let this animal die because of a concern that maybe people will confuse things. That's not really fair. So third answer. Rabbanan kaved Abaye. The rabbis brought the following answer in front of Abaye. If we leave this par, this is really the par that's owned by the Kohen Gadol, and therefore we're going to have a question, what about the seir? But let's start with the par. The par is owned by the Kohen Gadol. What if the Kohen Gadol dies by the next year? Right? Then we're going to end up with this par that the owner died, and therefore we don't want to end up in a situation where we'll have that. So again, they're going to say, well, hatinach par. Now it's the reverse of the last two. The last two only work for the goat. This one only works for the bull. This works fine for the bull, but seir ma'ika lememar. But there is no meitu baalim. The baalim are the all of Am Yisrael. We don't have such an issue of chatat meitu baaleha. So they say gzera seir atupal. So again, they answer like they did before. Let's make a decree on the goat so that you don't confuse and think the bull is okay to use. So again, they say mishum gzera yamutu. It doesn't make sense. It's going to die because of gzera. So move on to answer number 4. You can't have a chatat that's more than a year old, an animal. Now, if you leave it to next year, what's going to happen? It might be more than a year old. Now, what's the problem with that sentence I just said? Zera? What do you mean? It might be more than a year old. Clearly, a year has passed between Yom Kippur and the next. He gufa chatat avrash natai. This is a chatat. What do you mean? It might have passed its year. Of course it passed its year. You want to do something on this next Yom Kippur that could have been used on this Yom Kippur? Of course it's a year older. So you're going to say, oh no, halo kasha, that's not difficult. Okay, Rabbi, because we're going to hold like Rabbi in the following machloket, and I'm going to end mid-sentence. We're going to stop here because this kind of goes into tomorrow's daf, which explains this machloket, Rabbi and the rabbis, about how you count the year. And I'll just give you a hint. It has to do with leap years. Right? In the leap year, you could theoretically, if you hold by the leap year, then it's going to change when your year is, and it's possible that you might end up, he's still within his first year, even a year later. Interesting. Okay, we will pick up. So again, what did we do here? We had, just to do a quick review of the daf, we started with questions against Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, using our Mishnah with Rabbihooda's opinion mainly, and a little bit before that even a different, but basically trying to figure out how things work out according to Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Then we tried to understand better Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in the Mishnah. And then we brought up this issue of the shkalim comparison to the korbanot, and specifically focusing on Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that when it comes to shkalim, he thinks that you can use it for the upcoming year. But when it comes to a par seir of Yom Kippur, he doesn't think that you can save it for next year. And the question is, why do we distinguish those cases? We tried 4 answers. So far, we're in the middle of the 4th. The first 3 didn't really work. That will pick up from here tomorrow. Have a great day.